Hello, my name is Alan Tiller. I'm a librarian, author, paranormal investigator, and a student of history at UTAS. I've written ghost tours for local government and private enterprise, which has helped shape my research. My research addresses a gap in knowledge on the way commodified ghost tours are used during ghost tourism to represent important historical figures, locations, and history at Richmond and Port Arthur. Ghost tourism is a subgenre of dark tourism, which was defined in the 1990s as tourism that involves traveling to places associated with death and suffering. Ghost tourism is similar to dark tourism, but focuses on real human tragedy presented via metaphysical interpretations of events. Ghost tourism delivers an unspoken agreement between ghost tour guide and the customer that ghosts are present in the spaces tours visit. Ghost tourism relies heavily on literary ghost tropes and not the literal ghost. It became evident during my investigation that the popularity of ghost stories has paralleled social and economic upheavals in human history. When upheavals in society, such as industrial revolutions, occurred, society sought expression of their fears and escapism from the world around them, the representation of ghosts in literature. Fear of change is the driving force in human history and culture that has shaped literary ghost folklore, story trends, and tropes. Those trends and tropes evolved over time as more nuanced and sophisticated interpretations of ghost stories were presented to consumers via mass-produced publications. Societal upheavals, literary trends and tropes directly influenced the changes in the stories within the books I investigated. Gothic, Victorian-era ghost stories, spiritualism, Australian Gothic and its subgenre Tasmanian Gothic. It is also evident that modern horror movies have also influenced ghost tourism at Port Arthur and Richmond. Commodified ghost tours and literary publications of ghost stories rely heavily on local histories to create narratives presented to consumers that are firmly planted in historical fact, but rely on anecdotal ghost stories and experiences to attract consumers. For my research, I read several newspaper articles published in the 1890s that are the first recorded ghost stories of Port Arthur. Following that, I selected several true ghost story books from the 1960s through to 2012 that I read sequentially, comparing for variations in the stories. I then looked at internet sites for how these stories are told today and how they have changed. I found evidence of significant changes being made to stories discussed in my research, mostly relating to 6 key points. Embellishment, exaggeration, fabrication, misidentification, misinformation, modernization, and sensationalism. For example, the story of George Grover, a former convict flagellator who allegedly haunts the Richmond Bridge, began as an orally told ghost folklore. Grover was transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1825 for felony housebreaking. He was a career criminal who often found himself on the wrong side of the law. Eventually he became the convict flagellator at Richmond and was known for being harsh to his fellow convicts. In March 1832, Grover was found by a constable dying underneath the Richmond Bridge. He had been pushed over the edge. Grover was able to make accusations about his murderers before dying, but only one man was arrested. During the court case, it was claimed that Grover got drunk with the servants of Chief District Constable Gilbert Robinson. An argument broke out. Grover left, but fell asleep on the Richmond Bridge. He was thrown over the parapet, landing on the rocks below during the night. He was still alive when found the following morning. The verdict of the inquest was willful murder committed by James Coleman and other persons unknown. The Coleman's trial, the case could not be proven, with the jury returning the controversial verdict of not guilty. It is claimed George Grover haunts the Richmond Bridge and that his ghost is seen sitting on the riverbanks or hiding behind nearby trees watching people on the bridge. His ghost has been alleged to pace the span of the bridge. This local ghost folklore has been told for decades and retold with variations in many haunted location publications. In 1923, the Mercury newspaper reported on the incident, citing the murdered convict's name as Simon Groover. In his book Australian Ghost Stories, Frank Cusack states of the Richmond Bridge ghost that he was beaten to death by the manacles of his convict workmen and his mangled body cast into the river below. In Elizabeth Jones' 1973 publication, Richmond, Tasmania, A Crossing Place, Jones stated in her variation of the Richmond Bridge ghost folklore that the name Simon Groover was incorrect, changing his Christian name to George from Simon. That same spelling appears in Buck and Joan Emberg's version of the story in Ghostly Tales of Tasmania, but the timeline of Grover's deaths changes to an earlier date prior to 1832, and the ghost sometimes loses his head. A version of the ghost folklore at Richmond Bridge, as told by Richmond Ghost Tours owner Alan Jennison, appears in the 2010 book Something Is Out There by Julie Miller and Grant Osborne. This story greatly departs from previous tellings and from known history, and is an example of aspects of ghost folklore that is embellished, exaggerated, misidentified, misinformed, modernized, and sensationalized. According to Jennison, the local legend is that a convict was bricked up inside the bridge during its initial construction. A convict who died during construction was bricked up into one of the centre piers on the south side of the bridge, an inglorious resting place for someone considered of low social standing. Jennison further explains that vehicle accidents at the midway point of Richmond Bridge are somehow caused by the supernatural effects of the convict buried inside the bridge. He blames the haunting and the supernatural will of the ghost for other unrelated events occurring on the bridge. George Grover was buried in the nearby St. Luke's Anglican Cemetery after his death, and not inside the walls of the bridge. There is significance in understanding the factors that drive change in how ghost folklore is presented to the public. Change can be detrimental to historic locations if the changes deny or discredit historical events. This can lead to recipients of the story being misinformed or misunderstanding the use, importance, or significance of historical location, event, or person. The representation of a living person as a ghost may also be the first introduction of that once living person a tourist encounters. This may shape their perception of that person's life story, their personality, triumphs, and tribulations, and in some cases, misrepresent the historical importance of the person or misinform about historical aspects of that person's life, promoting misconceptions that in some instances could be considered slanderous if the represented dead was still among the living. Commodified ghost stories often challenge the expertise of orthodox sources of information regarding the past. Ghost tourism presenters and those retelling ghost folklores and ghost stories through media become custodians of history, which carries certain responsibilities, including accurately representing historical aspects of a ghost story, such as past events and people. Currently, there is little research on ghost tourism and its cultural impact in Australia. Further research on the origins of Australian ghost folklore and stories, how it changes with time, and its cultural significance are needed to expand the understanding of ghost tourism and the impact changes in story retellings have on history and heritage sites where ghost folklore is performed to an audience. Investigation and further research may reveal patterns of alteration that are related to commodification that misinforms, sensationalizes, exaggerates, or misidentifies a heritage or historical site, a historical figure, or a historical event. Studies and investigation could conclude whether these key elements have a positive or negative effect on tourism or the impression of a location that is taken away by tourists. It can be concluded that most ghost folklore presenters, whether an author, tour operator, blogger, documentarian, or television show, find it necessary to sensationalize, exaggerate, or modernize ghost folklore to meet the need of a modern sophisticated audience. Historical accuracy and the ethical treatment of the life stories of the represented dead are at the whim of the tour riders and operators. Ghost stories often deflect from the main historical aspects of a site where they are told. There is currently no dark tourism nor ghost tourism governing body, advisory board, industry standard, or regulation that requires tour companies that can modify ghost stories to adhere to historical accuracy. Thank you for your time.